Well, hey there. If you love the gospel story and the kind of art that stirs your soul, you're one of us already. So why not make it official? Join the Rabbit Room membership. By becoming a member, you'll be a partner in everything we create. Books, articles, events, and even podcasts, just like the one you're listening to right now. Plus, you'll enjoy exclusive perks throughout the year, and we'll even send you our classic member mug as our way of saying thank you. Join us today, or learn more at rabbitroom.com/membership. Have you ever wondered what might happen if someone mashed up The Princess Bride with Calvin and Hobbes? Oh, wow! So have we. Doesn't everyone? Well, thankfully, comic artist Johnny Jimison has arrived to satisfy this very specific itch with his graphic novel series, The Dragon Lord Saga. In vivid color and high adventure, you can join Martin, the stable boy, and Marco, his well-intentioned brother, as they embark on an epic story full of bandits and dragons, danger and humor, brotherhood and villainy, and just one, sarcastic talking horse. The third volume of this graphic novel saga, Dragons and Desperados, is now available from Rabbit Room Press. Visit the Rabbit Room store or your favorite bookseller and discover the secrets of the Dragon Lord today.
Hey y'all, Jonathan Rogers here. If you've listened to the Habit Podcast the last few weeks, you've probably heard me mention the Habit Writer Development Cohorts, a 6-week writing intensive to help writers like you recover your voice, build sustainable habits, and produce work that sounds exactly like you. I wanted to mention 2 developments about these cohorts. The first is that I've changed the dates. The cohorts are now going to run from June 9th through July 18th. Also, I've reduced the price for this first round of cohorts. You can get all the details and apply for one of the 16 spots at thehabit.co/cohorts. Now, on with the show.
Those kinds of stories that I think are the most captivating and the most true, and to me it turns out the Bible is full of that kind of pattern, that it is principle overcoming power, not just power overcoming power.
Welcome to the Habit Podcast, conversations with writers about writing. I'm Jonathan Rogers, your host. You may know Daniel Schwabauer from his one-year adventure novel and cover story writing curricula for students. He's also written fiction and nonfiction for readers of all ages, and he teaches English at Mid-America Nazarene University near Kansas City. His new book is The God of Story, Discovering the Narrative of Scripture Through the Language of Storytelling. In this episode, Daniel and I discuss ideals of power versus ideals of principle, story as a means of defamiliarization, and story as a truly terrible flight simulator. Daniel Schwabauer, I'm so happy to have you on the Habit Podcast, and I'm excited about talking about your new book, The God of Story. So thanks for being here.
Yeah, thank you for having me on. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Give me the short version of what's this book about.
Yeah, you're asking for a short version of a book that was shortened from a dissertation. So the short version.
So keep shortening.
Yeah. It's about reading the Bible as a story, the story of Scripture seen through the language of storytelling, which I believe is a kind of universal human language, and it matters because it's the one biblical language that everybody speaks. And unfortunately in the West, we're fluent, but we're not literate in the language of story. We speak it, we understand it, we are more immersed in story than any other people at any other time, probably. But we aren't as aware as we should be, especially in the church, of the techniques, the grammar of storytelling that are being used. And so we tend to flatten Scripture and not let ourselves see everything that's there.
Oh, okay. When you speak the grammar of story, tell me what you mean by that.
Yeah. So that could get really deep, but in this book, I tried to keep it to, characterization, plot, voice, theme, setting, or context. The 5 things that everybody studies when they're in, high school. You get an English class and someone will have you take it apart. So I tried to stay to those things, the basic story principles. Yeah.
Well, maybe let's start with the idea of defamiliarization, right? It means, in some ways, an important thing that a story does is it makes the unfamiliar approachable and makes the unfamiliar something I can make some sense of. But just as important is the fact that it makes the things I think I already know, it defamiliarizes them and awakens me to something. Is that a fair way of summarizing what you mean by defamiliarization?
Yes, yeah, and I think that's the Viktor Shklovsky, the Russian formalist, said that all art exists to make the stone stony again. Because when we, like, I go on a walk every morning with my two dogs, and I walk anywhere from 1 to 6 miles, but I always walk the same path, and I'm used to it. I've been doing it for years. And I have often thought that unless a house burns down along the way, I can get home and not remember anything that happened. I'm often distracted by listening to books or something,
Yeah, right.
which is a pleasant way to, to spend the time. But I need something to kind of shake me out of what my expectations are. I expect the landmarks, the turns, even the sound of birds, which is a little different every day. I'm expecting all of that, so I miss it. I don't actually see it. And this is true, I think, with scripture. It's true, but it's true with a lot of storytelling that we're not seeing what's there. We're seeing what we expect to be there.
Yeah.
And defamiliarization, the idea of art, I think, is that it forces us to see something anew, or at least that's the attempt. As I've heard you say on other podcasts, and we're talking about C.S. Lewis here, seeing Jesus as a lion in a fantasy world is a way of defamiliarizing Christ and helping us to see who he really is, right? Now it's obviously there are limitations to that, but that's the point, is it's getting us to recognize something that is in and around us all the time, but we don't see it because we take it for granted.
Yeah. You mentioned taking dogs on a walk, and dogs are always, they act like they've never seen this. Like, you take the dog on and it's just this adventure for them every time.
Yeah.
And part of that is, I think, that they are attentive to the smells, and the smells do change,
right,
in a way that's invisible to us, or we're smell blind too.
Yes. Yeah.
I don't know, that feels somehow relevant to me. The human being who is completely inattentive to what's going on, and the dogs who are completely in tune. And part of it maybe it has something to do with their memories, not like ours. I don't know.
Yeah. I've often thought that it's ironic that they get more out of the walks than I do. That I've even said that I'm on those walks. I'm generally of the world, but not in it. I'm somewhere else in my mind. I'm writing a chapter or something, and yet I'm out there fully exposed to the elements and all of that, and all these things happening around me. And I don't know how many times, because I've been doing it for years. I've seen deer, I've seen foxes, I've had creatures. I've passed by twice a fox that was probably 8 or 10 feet from me, just sitting there staring at me, and it took me a while to recognize that, oh, there's a cool fox right there.
Yeah.
What am I doing? I've had bobcats come out on the path right in front of me and, kind of startle me into, there's this beauty around me. What am I doing?
Yeah. And the dog is fully present.
Yes. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Just 10 minutes ago, my dog was wanting to fight a buzzard that was flying. I would have never noticed. And there, we didn't know what she was doing. And there it was. It was a buzzard up there that we were completely blind to.
Yeah.
Well, you say when we come to a text thinking we already know what we're going to find, that's what we find.
Yeah.
And, we have this habit of dismissing anything that doesn't align with our pre-existing assumptions. And, between social media algorithms and the way the news is presented and consumed now, I mean, even the news becomes a choose your own adventure thing.
Exactly. Yes.
And so I love that idea that story shakes us out of. I mean, I think it has a power to break through our expectations in a way that I think that's just seems to be the fact that it breaks through our expectations in a way that mere logic.
Yeah, if we let it.
What's that? If we let it.
If we let it, yeah, yeah. But the problem is that often, especially with something like the Bible, where we've been, if you've grown up in the church or you're regularly attending, even excellent sermons that will unpack something a certain way, that you can get into I hesitate to call it a trap, but the idea that you're always seeing something from the same perspective and never backing up and saying, what if there's something different going on here? And one example I like to use is the two times that Nathan, the prophet, confronts David, King David. Almost everybody knows the story of Nathan confronting David and using a story to convict him, right? If he'd have gone in there and said, "Hey, you committed murder and adultery, God's really unhappy." I mean, what's David going to do? He's going to have a head cut off, probably. But he tells him a story, and he gets David to come to the conclusion in a way that just a direct approach wouldn't have done, probably. And so everybody knows that story. It's a wonderful illustration of the point. But there's another time when Nathan confronts David, and no one seems to know what to do with it. And I just think it's a marker. It's a story marker in the text. It's after the boy Solomon is born. Nathan comes to David and says, "Name the boy Jedediah." And the narrative seems to just drop that as if it didn't matter, but it's included because it matters. In my opinion, right? It's there for a reason. It's showing us something, and I think that what it's doing is it's showing us the path that Solomon goes down. Solomon's name means something like peace, and Jedediah means loved by God. And if you follow the story of Solomon, what you see is Solomon rejecting the love of God in order to make peace through his own human efforts and wisdom. And that sacrifice results in Israel becoming another Babylon. And so I think, obviously you can interpret that. People are, able to interpret that different ways, but we ignore the thing as if it doesn't exist because we often don't know what to do with it, and because we're not looking at it as a story where things are intentionally included, often in a way that's a kind of puzzle that makes us lean in and say, what's going on here? If we're willing to admit, I missed something. What did I miss? What is this? Right?
Yeah.
But my wife likes to say, our Bible cups are already filled. And when your Bible cup is filled, it can't be filled anymore. You have to kind of empty it out and say, what am I missing?
Yeah. Yeah. Speaking of that idea of emptying the cup or clearing the decks so that we can, think differently, I'm always thinking about the ways that in the parables Jesus was being intentionally offensive, finding ways to shake things up. All the ways that he forces us to say, either I'm wrong about this or God's wrong about this.
Yeah.
The older brother who keeps his nose clean.
Right.
It's a little offensive that he is the bad guy in that story.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. And I really love Henri Nouwen's take on that, his book, Return of the Prodigal Son, which is it's a short exploration of his own meditations on the painting by Rembrandt, where, hey, I've been the prodigal. I didn't think I was the prodigal, but I really was the prodigal. And then, oh, hey, I've also been the older son. Yeah. And then, hey, I think I need to be the father, which is it's not saying I need to be God. It's saying I need to be the older one welcoming back the returning prodigals. It's really profound to me as an illustration that the metaphors of Jesus, the parables of Jesus, are probably not intended to be taken only one way. They're just so full of meaning, which is why preachers have been preaching sermons on the parable of the prodigal son that are different and largely true. For 2,000 years, we've been seeing things in them that is deeper in many ways than just an explicit statement. This is what God is like.
Yeah, because explicit language, by definition, is unambiguous. Right? We're trying to find language that is precise and therefore doesn't admit a whole lot of interpretation.
And we're not comfortable with ambiguity,
right?
And that's a problem. If you compare characters in the Old Testament, the most thoroughly complex character in the Old Testament, in my opinion, is King David. But David is also the one who has the most ambiguous language.
Tell me more about that.
Well, the things that David says can be interpreted more than one way, and the things that Saul says are generally not very ambiguous. And even the prophets, right? The prophets say things that can be interpreted more than one way. They say things frequently that are. Jesus even unpacks things that Moses said that nobody had thought of before, but it's right there. And like it's right there in front of us, right? He's not the God of the dead, but the God of the living. I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, right? So Jesus pulls from that. To die isn't to die. Well, who would have thought of that except Jesus, who wrote it, right? I mean, who would have thought of that? But it's the ambiguity in some of the things Moses says and things Jesus says are, I think, invitations to look deeper. And I don't know if you, I mean, obviously, I hope this is obvious. I'm not saying things that in a didactic way that I'm saying this is what this means. I'm just saying things that it didn't occur to me until I started trying to defamiliarize my own mind to Scripture. What is this saying? Salt and light, when in context, as an example, salt is a symbol of the everlasting covenant that God makes with humanity that has to be put on every sacrifice. And so when Jesus says, if the salt loses its saltiness, what good is it? It always puzzled me until I started thinking, what if he's not thinking of the mineral being used as a preservative, which is the way it's usually unpacked. What if he's talking about persecution, which all of a sudden makes that whole passage make sense because it's in the context of persecution. You and your persecution is a sign to people of God's covenant with people. And if you lose your saltiness, where you're not willing to go on the fire, if you lose that, what good are you? Even the world will trample you because they'll look at you and say, what a hypocrite that person is. He claimed to be this thing, but he wasn't willing to sacrifice himself for it, which is part of supposedly part of the story. And so, I mean, I realize it's not the only way to interpret that, but I'm saying because it is multivalent, it has multiple meanings. If we stop with one and we don't recognize the ambiguity because pointing to deeper layers of meaning, we're going to miss the deeper layers of meaning.
Yeah. Well, I often say metaphor or symbolic language works in literature because it's because it's the way the world works.
Yes.
And so, and it is, metaphor can only work because the things of the world are ambiguous or multivalent, to borrow the term you were using. Salt means a few different things, and that's why it can be used as a metaphor. And the language of proposition tries to, chop up that ambiguity or that multivalence and say, here's one meaning. And then you can also make propositional statements that, that together maybe cover more ground.
Yes.
But any one propositional statement, it seems to me, is an effort to multivalence the multivalent.
Yes. Yeah. And when you're just looking at one layer of it, I mean, there is in the book, I talk about this, the different layers that the rabbinic, in the time, the rabbinic method, they would look at the literal interpretation, and then a more typological interpretation, and a metaphorical, and then a revelational. And, who knows how many layers there are. After looking at this and studying, I read the Bible every day for 23 years, and before I went back to school. And I feel like if I live to be 120, I will maybe know 1% of it, but probably not. I mean, the limitations on me are so great. How am I ever going to unpack what is here? It's just marvelous. And I love that about it, that there's always new things that strike me as, how did I not see that?
Yeah.
Like all this time, and I missed it. It's right there in front of me.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
Yeah. Well, let's talk for a minute about deduction, induction, abduction. Have not been familiar with the term abduction in your use until I read your book. But yeah, deduction. I guess we start with a big idea, an abstraction, and then marshal examples
Yes. Yeah.
to illustrate that.
Right.
The inverted triangle or inverted pyramid.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And yeah, tell me about deduction, and then we'll move on to induction and abduction.
Deductive structure is the default structure of hard news, and it's the default structure of hard news and propaganda as well, in part because it starts with one big statement or one idea. And this is hard journalism. If you've ever taken a journalism class, you'll see there's the first paragraph is the nut graph. It's the paragraph that contains basically the who, what, when, where, why, and how of the story. And if readers stop reading after the first paragraph, they know basically what happened. And so you can take almost any, well-written hard news story, and it will have the basic facts at the beginning, and then it will get more specific as the story goes on. That is really useful because you can give a lot of information in a short period of time. It's also useful for writers because it lends itself to quick, fact-based writing that journalism requires. So it's very useful. You can pull the facts that you want to support your main point, which is the bigger point, which is why it's the main method of propaganda. Propagandas being stories that are narrations that are created through the use of carefully curated facts, right? Propaganda is not based on lies, it's based on facts. And so it's deductive in nature usually because you give the big kind of storyline and then you give all the facts that support it and you leave out the facts that don't support it. And at the risk of offending pastors, a lot of sermons are written deductively because you can start with the main point you want people to get, and then you can arrange verses in a way that supports the idea, and you don't have to deal with ones that don't support the idea.
Yeah.
And I'm honestly not saying that that's a bad thing for pastors to do. I'm just saying we are very used to that kind of writing. I teach comp. I have to teach that kind of writing. But it's kind of the way we end up assuming that the Bible is written. And there's another kind of the inductive is basically flipping that around, which is the domain of novels and movies and longer forms that start with some here and now experience, and they lead you through these scenes and chapters, conversations, and by the end you get to something that is more of a concluding idea. And that in its simplest form is basically Aesop's fables. So you have the concluding moral at the end. You get a cute little story, and then you get a concluding moral, which is interesting to me because most people can't remember the concluding moral. But if I were to ask, the fox and the grapes, if you've heard the story once, you can probably come kind of close to it.
Yeah.
I've read the concluding moral at least a dozen times, and I can never remember it. My brain just does not want to hold on to the larger principle, though I can explain the larger principle.
Yeah, right. In Aesop's defense, I think those morals were added later.
Yeah, yes, but as a structure, the thing we think it's leading up to is the concluding, the neat package that ties it all together for us, because we think that's the point.
Yeah.
And so I don't know if we need to do abductive now, if I'm getting too professorial here.
Well, real quick, just give us the abductive.
So abductive is inductive, but without the concluding moral at the end. So it leads you through the evidence, but it doesn't tell you what the conclusion is. And so it's basically it's a right side up pyramid with all the details that are drawing you along, and then it doesn't mean it doesn't resolve as a story. It just means it's not explicitly telling you the theme. You have to contemplate it. You have to ponder, what does this mean? And in my opinion, this is what I call the storyteller's parable in Mark chapter 4, and in Matthew 13, I think, where he's talking about the parable of the sower, and he is asked by the disciples, "Why are you speaking in parables?" And he, in answering that question, tells the parable of the lamp on the stand. Why do you put a lamp on a stand? So there's more about it in the book. But basically, they say, "Why are you doing this?" And he says, "It's to make the light go farther," which blows our minds as Enlightenment rationalists. How
Yeah.
does it make the light go farther if you're not explaining the story to everybody? And I think the abductive process is the explanation that when you don't know quite what it means, you're left with that hanging question. And you can either walk away from it and say, I just don't know and I don't care,
Mm-hmm.
or you can. The metaphor I like to use is Easter eggs. It's a good time to talk about Easter eggs. He has a field full of Easter eggs, and he has a sign on it, Jesus does, that says Easter eggs here. But you have to search for them, and that's why in the follow up to that parable of the sower and the lamp on the stand thing, he says, "Consider carefully what you hear, for with the measure you use, it will be measured to you." And we think that's a disconnected thought, and it's not a disconnected thought at all. It's still part of his method, his parable, moving metaphor method of teaching theology, teaching what God is like, by forcing people to either ask important questions or say, "I don't care," and turn around and walk away.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a Christopher Nolan movie is so complex that I just have to say, usually, I don't care. I'm not even interested in figuring
Uh-huh.
this out. I mean, there are certain art forms that, and I know, most smart people, you're supposed to love Christopher Nolan movies. I understand that. And the people whose taste I, you know, admire tend to like his movies. But for me, it's just, I can't, there are certain things that you just can't, that you just say, I don't care enough. And so I guess part of having ears to hear is being willing to care enough to keep
Yeah.
digging.
Yeah, I think so. And I like some Christopher Nolan movies, but I think one problem I have with some of what he's produced is that it doesn't appear to be true to me. That there's something about Interstellar that is kind of a trick on the audience at the end that I think doesn't work structurally. It doesn't mean that I think he's not a good director. It's just, yeah, I've seen, what was it, Tenet, I think, that was looked a little too like he was just messing around with his equipment.
Yeah.
See, I've always thought it cool to show things backwards, and I know there's more layered into it, but it's not something that resonates with me, so I don't care either.
Yeah.
The movie that I liked a lot from him was The Dark Knight. I thought those movies did a good job of exploring the themes, even if they're not necessarily right in their exploration. They do a good job of exploring them. So,
Yeah.
yeah, I think of the invitation to ponder, and nobody does it better than Jesus. And we're still, we've translated the parable of the prodigal son into over 1,300 languages from a language that probably wasn't the language that it was originally told in, and it still works. It's
Yeah.
working all around the world right now on different people, different languages, twice removed from the original. It's still working. And that is phenomenal to me, and actually significant as well, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. And maybe not that I mean, obviously, in some regard, that's unique to Jesus' storytelling. But also, I think a big important point from your book is that language of storytelling. The fact that these stories work in any language is evidence, or is testament to the fact that story is a universal language.
That's something I tried to argue in the book. I don't know whether people want to go there or whether the argument is convincing. But to me, it was a freeing idea in that it shows a shared humanity, and it actually makes, in a sense, it makes sense of Scripture, that it's okay for it to be translated into many different languages,
Yeah.
but that there could be a unifying kind of underlying grammar of character arcs and
Yeah.
plot, and this idea of the abductive, hiding things in order to bring revelation, which I think is the important thing to understand about this, that Jesus deliberately hid things in his story, because in order to have a revelation about something, you have to discover, or the thing has to be disclosed that was hidden, right? If it's not a revelation if you already know it,
Yeah.
right? So
Yeah.
in order to
Yeah.
create revelation in the reader, through the story, just through the text of the story being retold, there has to be a hiding of it. And so I think that's what, not to beat up on Christian art, there's a lot of good Christian stuff being produced, but there's been a lot of bad too, because we've been trained to think deductively and inductively and not abductively, to not allow the audience the dignity of discovering the thing. And so we aren't artistic enough about hiding in order to make the stone stony again, forcing the reader to look at it, or the viewer to look at it from a different perspective. I think this is what we need to relearn. That people, great writers, Lewis, Tolkien, Flannery O'Connor, writers who are accessible to us, were doing this in their work, consciously trying to do it. And I think it's probably on the way back. My sense of it.
Here's hoping.
Yeah.
All right, I want to talk about an image that you. It's funny. I've never in my own writing and talking used the image of a flight simulator before, but I've said the similar things, and you critique it, and it's super interesting. So tell me about the idea of story as flight simulator and why that's maybe not as helpful as it first appears.
Well, it's a clever way, in my opinion, it's a clever way of showing us what story could be for, if story is an evolutionary function, right, of human life. That it's, you tell a story, you tell the story to your kids, and then they understand how to not get eaten by the bear, right? So that's the idea. I think that when your only tool is evolution, everything looks like descent with modification. Just like, if your only tool is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And story doesn't work like this, in my opinion. Story is actually the opposite of this. The closer a thing is in reality to the solution in a story, so the more explicit the solution is to a real life problem, the less effective it will be in the story.
Okay.
So, as an example, is the solution to poverty that you sell your last cow to a stranger for a bag of magic beans? No, it is not.
Yeah.
It's not a good plan, right?
Yeah.
Just as the solution to being an abused child of a wicked stepmother is probably not to hope that your fairy godmother shows up and turns, pumpkins into a coach.
Yeah.
That's not a reasonable solution. So those
this is not practical advice.
right. It's not. They're not meant to be. And it's not just fairy tales that are like this, but fairy tales are a good example because they're so ubiquitous, and they're so around the world, they're used in a sense to pass on wisdom.
Yeah.
But the ones that survive, I think could be Darwinian in a sense. The ones that survive are the ones that are effective. So they work on us emotionally, but they also carry some germ of truth.
Yeah.
So in the story of Jack and the Beanstalk, what is that story about then? Right? I mean, if it's not the solution to something, well, I mean, he climbs a giant beanstalk into the clouds and finds there's land there, with an ogre and his wife, and there's the singing harp. I mean, like, what in the world is going on? And this may be too in the weeds, but it might be worth just a real quick. The thing people remember from fairy tales is usually a clue to what it means. So in Jack and the Beanstalk, you get, fee fi fo fum, I smell the blood of an Englishman, right? It's not a Dutchman, it's not a Frenchman, it's not an American. And my sense of that story is that its theme is actually embedded there. That what Jack has done may be foolish, but it's also courageous. And what he does is he goes to a far off place to take on a giant and basically bring back its wealth. That's essentially what he does. And what does the British Empire need? They need young boys to believe in themselves as being courageous, being willing to go off and fight monsters in far off places and bring back wealth for the nation. It's probably a form of propaganda in a sense.
Yeah.
But that idea is not explicit in the story. And that's one reason the story works so well as a story.
Yeah.
So there, obviously you can, once you take, C.S. Lewis talked about this, once you take a class of experience out of the story and you start analyzing it, you're no longer in the story and it can no longer work the way it works in the story. So it's almost always impossible to really pluck a class of experience from a story and make it explicit and have it still be, useful or functional. Yeah. Instead, the best you can do is talk a little bit about it the way you can talk about a dream that you had that was, you can never quite capture the vividness, the feeling, the doom that you felt or whatever. You can never quite capture that, but you can sort of talk about it and analyze it a little bit. And stories are, in a sense, the same way.
Yeah. You say, one thing I thought was funny about that was that if these are indeed a flight simulator where you can experience danger, you can experience some experience, learn from it, and then come back alive, you say it's the worst flight simulator ever. It's basically a flight simulator that brings a plane in upside down.
Yeah.
Because there aren't any stories that say that show you that the rich get richer and might makes right and the poor get poorer.
Yep.
Right? We don't need those stories. The world's telling us that all day, every day. And these a story gets at the paradoxical nature of reality. I know what you see with your eyeballs is a world where all that matters is power, where you better watch out to make sure you get what's yours. And there's no story where there's this giant, and then because he's so big, he's able to smash everybody. The end.
Yeah.
That's
yep. Right.
And so the story presents us with the counterintuitive nature of reality.
Yeah.
And I love that insight. And as you say, we're not clear thinkers, we're story thinkers.
Yeah.
And I don't know what the next where to go from there in terms of the conversation, but you may have something to say about that.
Well, that I think is one of the most important things to understand about story, especially in the church. If the church is going to delve deeper into our story, the thing that really connects us together and that is the primary vehicle for communicating hope to the world, then we need to understand the nature of story. And I love the way you put it. It is not teaching us how to get along in the world better. No stories are really doing that are successful as stories. And the Bible isn't primarily concerned with that either. It is showing us things like moral absolutes and how to live rightly and what is the meaning of life and how to apprehend that meaning for ourselves. And all those things are embedded in the story, but when we start thinking, oh yeah, it's how to survive better. No, it's really not.
Yeah, you talk about the ideals of power versus the ideals of principle, which are often in conflict in a story. Yes. Maybe I would say almost maybe always in conflict in a story. Yeah. And stories are good at managing and handling the principles, the ideals of principle that often get squashed in the real world, where the ideals of power seem to almost always win out, except that it's almost always, not always.
Right. Yeah, that's to me one of the things that really wanted when I started to recognize this. It's one of the things that made me want to write this book. Is I see in most stories that are today in just I'll call them Marvel movies, but there's a lot of other novels and things that follow this formula. You'll have power versus power, but it's a principled power versus an unprincipled power. You have the principled Spider-Man versus the unprincipled Green Goblin, and just essentially endless variations of that. The good guy is good, but he's also a superhero. The bad guy is bad, and he's also a superhero. or
Yeah.
of some kind. And the problem with that is what it does unconsciously to us is it makes us servants of power.
Wow.
And
That's good.
it puts principle under power. It makes and what it hides from us is that power. This is kind of the point of the 6th chapter about Job. It hides from us that our real allegiance, which is what Satan is saying about Job to God, is that our real allegiance is to power. It's not to God because he's good. It's to God because he's powerful. And there's another kind of story that is not nearly as common. It's the one that I think the Inklings deliberately wrote, and I don't know that they would have used this language, but I think of it as stories that stem from the tree of life and stories that stem from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And this seems like such an odd pairing to many people, but if you think of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil as the tree of deciding for yourself what we will call good and what we will call evil, that is exactly what movies do for us. That's exactly what even the old Star Trek, the red shirts kind of thing. We don't care about the red shirt engineers getting off on the planet. What we care about is, Captain Kirk and Spock and Bones, etc. So this other alternative story is just pitting principle, raw principle with no seeming power to it, against raw power with no seeming principle to it, no underlying good principle. And that the illustration I use in the book is the Tiananmen Square conflict, where you had all these, main battle tanks rolling in, and this guy with a bag of groceries standing in front of the tank. It's like he had no power to stop those tanks. All he had was the power to put himself in front of it and get run over.
Yeah.
And yet, that power ended up being a kind of power. His principle, his courage, captured the imagination of the world. And it did something. Now, I couldn't tell you what I'm not a historian, and I remember it. I'm old enough to remember it, but I couldn't tell you what all the repercussions were. But as a story illustration, it is those kinds of stories that I think are the most captivating and the most true. And to me, it turns out the Bible is full of that kind of pattern, that it
Yeah.
is principle overcoming power, not just power overcoming power.
Oh yeah, so good. And we love that image so much, that idea so much, and it's so deep in us that, well, at one point in the book you say we can use any language can be used to lie, including
Yeah.
the language of story.
Yeah.
And but that doesn't change. The way you lie in a story is to invert who's the victim and who's, so
Yeah.
the real victim here is the casino, not the,
Yeah.
not the Ocean's
Right.
11 team,
Right.
or,
Right.
and which this is, there's a whole industry, the whole lobbying industry is
Yep.
based on, the real victim here is the tobacco industry, or,
Yeah. Yeah.
by defining who's the victim, or, the real victim here is the billionaires, not the widows and the orphans and the immigrants and and the refugees. It's the, and so those dynamics, the dynamic doesn't change in
Right.
terms of what story appeals to us. You may, in an unprincipled way, flip over, who's where in the story, who's the hero and who's not. But
Yeah.
the dynamic is universal.
Yes. Yeah. And I think until the church starts to more clearly recognize that we are I'm susceptible to propaganda. My emotions are accessible to storytellers
Yeah.
who are using these techniques against me to try to shift my thinking and therefore shift my behavior. Until the church starts to recognize we have an alternate story. We have a tree of life story that is actually more potent, even though the story structure is pits powerlessness against power, or principle against power. That idea is so in itself world changing and it's the very heart of the gospel, right? The cross, Jesus on the cross, Father, forgive them, they know not what they do. The idea of the pure, no contamination to it, the love of God making himself vulnerable to the power of humans and not resisting but just offering himself. Now, obviously there's atonement theories and there's all these things you can do with this. But as a story device, that story is so remarkably powerful, and we often miss that is what we're invited into. We're invited into Jesus's story, to follow him wherever he leads, and to take up his methods and his method of principle. And it's more than that, which, I get into the book at the end with the Ubuntu thing. But it's hard to recognize the power of the last thing if you don't recognize the importance of the two the power versus power, or principle versus power dynamics.
Yeah. Well, Daniel, there's about 6 more things I want to talk about from your book. It's so rich. There's so much good things going on there, but we're out of time. Would you just close us out by telling, who are some writers who make you want to write?
Oh boy, I try to read widely. This is going to sound terrible. I really like Robert Heinlein because of his storytelling.
Okay.
So when I read a story by him that just seems effortless, and even if I don't agree with some of the things in it, it makes me want to be a better storyteller. When I read G.K. Chesterton's storytelling is not great, in my opinion. He's a kind of weird storyteller, but his insight into the nature of things is so profound. I know I'm never going to be Chesterton. I'm never going to be Heinlein. I'm never going to be Lewis. I'm never going to be Tolkien. But these are people I read where I go, wow, there's something here that is so cool. I've learned not to wish that I had someone else's superpower and just say, what is it that I can do? But that doesn't mean I can't appreciate those things and go, well, okay, this makes me want to write. But I'm old enough now to know I need to write like me, not write like someone else.
Yeah.
Wish I could write like Flannery O'Connor. I can't write like
right. Yeah. Yes. One, The Man Who Was Thursday is enough, probably. We don't need another one of those, right?
Yes. Yeah. I love that story.
I do too, but it's wild.
It is wild. Yeah.
All right. Well, Daniel Schwabauer, thank you so much for being here. It's been a pleasure.
Hey, thank you for having me on. I really enjoyed it.
The Habit Podcast is brought to you by The Rabbit Room, where art nourishes community and community nourishes art. You can support their work, including this podcast, by becoming a member. Visit rabbitroom.com/membership. Special thanks as well to Taylor Leonard for letting us use her song Diamonds as the theme music for the Habit Podcast. You can learn more about Taylor and follow her work at taylorleonard.com. The Habit Membership is a library of resources for writers by me, Jonathan Rogers. More importantly, The Habit is a hub of community where like-minded writers gather to discuss their work and give each other a little more courage. Find out more at thehabit.co.
If you've enjoyed this podcast episode, consider joining the Rabbit Room membership. Your membership helps sustain this community, funding everything from publishing and podcasts and theater productions to events and programs that support artists who create with a Christ-centered vision. We'd love to have you on board. Learn more at rabbitroom.com/member.